2 o'clock here, so we'll get going. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Royal Turtle Museum Speaker Series, generously sponsored by the Royal Turtle Museum Cooperating Society. My name is Christopher West. I'm one of the researchers here at the museum. And today I'm happy to host Dr. Anne-Marie Tosolini, who is a professor at the University of Melbourne. Anne-Marie's research in paleontology is interdisciplinary, combining sedimentary geology and fossil plants. Her research aims to understand changes in plant community ecosystems through time and plant relationships to their past environments and climates. She mainly focuses on Cretaceous Cenozoic time periods. Anne-Marie completed a PhD at the University of Melbourne in 2001 and held a postdoctoral fellowship for 3 years jointly with the University of Leeds and the British Antarctic Survey, Cambridge in the UK. She collected fossil plants from the field in Antarctica during her postdoctoral research. The fossils were used to interpret past forest ecosystems and climate changes before and after the rapid warming events of the Cenozoic, known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. She spent the following 4 years as a lecturer at La Trobe University before joining the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Melbourne in 2010. So very happy to have you here, Anne-Marie, and go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much, Chris. And thanks for having me at the Royal Turtle Museum. My name is Anne-Marie, and today I will talk about the ancient floras of Antarctica as indicators of past climate. So even though most people call me Anne-Marie, I also go by the name of Dr. Tosolini because I am a paleontologist at the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences in the University of Melbourne. Just recently joined with geography. So I hear that it's a couple of degrees below zero where you are, and it's actually morning here in Australia, and we're heading for a top close to 40 degrees Celsius above zero today. So your current weather is a little bit more akin to what I'll be talking about today, looking at Antarctica and the fact that there are some fossils there that we collected and how they are significant in terms of understanding the past, but also as indicators of past climate. So Antarctica is a vast continent of ice, thick ice sheets, up to 4 kilometers thick in some places, stretch right across the entire continent. And you can see the eastern sector is divided from this western part by the Transantarctic Mountains. And I'll be focusing on this Antarctic Peninsula region, which stretches up towards South America. So it is the driest continent on Earth, a world of extremes. And when we talk about life in the freezer, well, no, the polar bears are more up your way. We have the penguins and seals, but there's very limited diversity. And in terms of the flora, remarkably, for an entire continent, there's only 2 species of flowering plants. So the flowering plants actually constitute up close to 75% of most of the world's flora. But down in Antarctica, it's mostly mosses and lichens and liverworts and fungi. So how can there possibly be fossils down here? So it's not only important, this continent is not only important for modern research into understanding the geology and the modern climate, but also it's been a real draw card for explorers all through recent times with it's at the last frontier, this continent, and so remarkable exploration has occurred down in Antarctica. And we see Ernest Shackleton as one of the people who have made their name in history. He first went to Antarctica on the Robert Falcon Scott 1901 expedition. They stayed behind in base camp whilst 4 of them took their, Scott and his colleagues took their sleds and tried to race to the South Pole, being beaten by Amundsen. Ernest Shackleton also went on the 1907 Nimrod expedition, where he was leading his own party to try to reach the South Pole. And famously, in 1914, he went on the Endurance, HMS Endurance. And 1915, this ship got stuck in the Weddell Sea. So we're going to be looking at an area in Antarctica very close to where this extraordinary expedition occurred, and they all managed to survive. But the sink did get stuck in the ice and sank in the Weddell Sea. And remarkably, it was recovered just a year ago. So you can see the preservation in this Weddell Sea. So let's have a look at the map, the Antarctic Peninsula. Just before we do, I just wanted to also talk about, at the same time as Scott and Amundsen were racing to the pole, the Swedish South Polar Expedition went to the Antarctic Peninsula in 1901 for 2 years, and the scientist was Otto von Nordenskjold. So he had already been shown large tree stumps and wood, fossilized wood from Antarctic Peninsula collected by Norwegian whalers at the time. And so he was there to try to see what could be discovered. He actually discovered large deposits of fossil leaves. So he took them back to Sweden, and they were described in 1908 by Dusan from the Swedish Museum of Natural History, who described and photographed 87 different types of plants. So how could this be? And were they really going to stand up to modern analysis as well? So we were hoping to go and make only the second collection in over 100 years from these sites. So here is the map of Antarctica showing the peninsula. And here is the Weddell Sea on the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula, which is a volcanic chain. And you can see the James Ross Island. And this is little Seymour Island where we went. So the Nordenskjold locality here, and we also found some more localities up the northern part of Seymour Island. So from Australia, I actually had to go to Britain to work at the British Antarctic Survey and the University of Leeds. So whilst in Britain, they were preparing us for any cases of dramatic crevasse type difficulties on the ice. So we had lots of rope training on the tallest cliffs that they could find in England. Here we can see the teams that were the scientific teams were supported by mountaineers. So once we were heading down to Antarctica, we stopped in the Falklands, and we were accompanied in by the tornadoes. So we were working with the British Royal Navy. So we were lucky to go on the namesake of the HMS Endurance, this modern Norwegian icebreaker ship, a lot more comfortable. And thankfully, we didn't have the same outcome as the original. You can see here in the background Seymour Island. So when we left England, it was actually a few degrees below zero, snowing, icy. But when we got to Antarctica, Seymour Island from the air here, you can see it was very, very warm. And so we were in the tropical part of Antarctica, if you like. In fact, I'll just go back to that map. The 65 degrees south of the Antarctic Circle here, Seymour Island just sneaks in there. So we were helicoptered into the field, and we were staying for the couple of months in these Scott-style tents, unchanged since 1901. We had Scott-style stoves, and pretty much the equipment and certainly the food was very similar, with army ration food, dried beef granules. But the bonus was we got a block of chocolate a day. It's such extreme environment to survive in. You can see here little Coburn Island off the coast of Seymour Island. So we had planned a couple of different sites for collecting. And these were my partners in crime, if you like, my colleagues, Professor Dame Jane Francis, who is now Director of the British Antarctic Survey, and David Cantrell, who's now a professor and chief scientist at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, and our mountaineer, Scottish mountaineer, Robert Smith. Hope I pronounced that correctly. So originally it was, when we first got there, it was 8 degrees above in Celsius, and so there was a lot of snow runoff. The ice shelf had already retreated during the late 80s from this little island, the Larsen ice shelf, and subsequently that was 1/3 of the ice shelf in the 80s, and subsequently in the early 2000s, the last part of this Larsen ice shelf collapsed. The amazing thing for paleontologists is that there is all of this bare rock exposed underneath. So this island of Seymour Island was a paleontologist's dream. There were just fossils littering the surface, literally. But the ice melt and snow melt created a few problems for us early on. But the issue, standard issue clothing was a bit much. We can see my backpack piled with layers and layers because it was very, very warm. Later in the season, though, we almost didn't have enough. We'd had storms come in, and we weren't equipped for such huge amounts of snow dumps and some other events, which I will go into. So the meltwater created this huge river across valley, and this is the first locality where the Northern Shoal fossils were located. And you can see that if you don't manage to get up enough speed across these mud plains and these areas, then you can actually get bogged. So we did have these all-terrain vehicles to help us not only get around, but also to collect the fossils. Later in the season, as I mentioned, after the huge storms, we were actually trapped in the tent, so we weren't able to do a lot of work. But once the sun came out, we were able to get out again. So we were fortunate to have 2 months in this exquisite environment. It's very, very, very special. And so I feel very fortunate that I've been to experience that. So what were we going to be doing down there? Not just collecting the fossil plants, but once we got back to the lab, we could analyze these fossils and work out what it was telling us about the climates in Antarctica from the past. So we were focusing on a time from after the extinction of the dinosaurs during the earliest part of the Cenozoic era, known as the Paleogene. So the Paleogene consists of 3 epochs: Paleocene, Eocene, and Oligocene. So we're trying to establish what was the floral composition. Was the original analysis from over 100 years ago, was that correct? What's going on with these forests in terms of the composition and the development of these forests? Were they quite early establishers? But there were certainly lots of trees from the fossil wood, we could tell. But also, how did that biodiversity actually respond to changing climates? So we can look at an overview of the Cenozoic with dramatic changes from greenhouse to icehouse climates after these Paleogene. So before we look at the fossils themselves, just a little bit of background, because Antarctica currently has huge influence on the global climate in 2 main ways: in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean. So for the influences in the atmosphere, the extent of the ice sheets across Greenland and the ice caps in Antarctica cause reflectivity, what's known as ice albedo, where the sun's solar radiation is reflected back into space. So the larger the area at the surface of the Earth, the greater the reflectivity. So this has been able to establish these icehouse climates on Earth that humans have evolved in. In the 80s, it was also discovered there was a large hole over the Antarctic in the atmosphere, which had significant impact on the southern hemisphere, which has a lot less land surface and a lot more ocean than the northern hemisphere as well. But thankfully, we have been able to act and help to repair this ozone hole. And we've seen ocean circulation, where we see the natural melting of the glaciers over geological time as well, but in recent times, has caused very, very cold water to enter into the oceans. And so because it's so cold, it will sink and cause these deep currents that move up the west coast of South America and start what's known as the global ocean conveyor belt. And the Northern Hemisphere plays a significant part as well with meltwater from the Arctic. So we were trying to establish, can the fossils be used as climate indicators of the past? How did this time in the Paleogene help us to understand the formation of both the Antarctic continent and the ice sheets, and what was going on during the whole Cenozoic with warming and cooling? What small part could we play in understanding the overall past climates? So let's look at the fossils from Antarctica. There are dinosaurs, and recently there was an amazing IMAX movie about dinosaur discoveries in Antarctica. And so these are such a charismatic and unique fauna in time that they're really a good placeholder for people to understand geological time in the past. So I've worked on forests from southern Australia when it was joined to Antarctica at this time, but when we were going to Antarctica to discover these fossil leaves, it was from immediately after the extinction of dinosaurs into the Paleocene, as I mentioned. So we were looking at fossils that were from about 56 to 57 million. So the latest Paleocene time period, it was the epoch immediately after the extinction of the dinosaurs, 66 million years ago. And the end of the Paleocene, beginning of the Eocene, sits directly at 56 million there. So just to give you some context there, we are here in the early January collecting in the beautiful sunny weather, nice and warm. You can see that there's no ice and very little snow. And so, as I said, a paleontologist's dream of just fossils littering the surface, but we did actually have to dig a bit with our rock hammers to open up these beautiful layers and find the fragile leaf impressions in Antarctica. And so we actually managed to collect a whole ton of rock that contained these exquisite fossils to be able to take back to the lab. During the season, the storms that came in were force 10, 100-knot winds. We had to hide away in our tents, and it was a bit like living in a drum. The noise was incredible. We ended up with our whole tent pegs and aerials and everything frozen into the ground. So in fact, the sea ice was blown in by these extreme weather storms, and it blocked the passage of our ship to come back. The Royal Navy HMS Endurance couldn't return to pick us up, but they were a distance away that was just the extent of the helicopter range. So they gave us two options. One was just to stay the entire winter, and they were going to generously drop a little bit of extra food for us. Or else the other alternative that they could come up with was to just collect the people to take back to the ship, and we would have to leave all our rocks. Now, the only reason we were there was to collect these fossils. So that really wasn't very much of an option for us either. But thankfully, we were on this, sharing this amazing environment in Antarctica with other scientists from Argentina. And so we got to know them, and we spoke to them, and the Argentinian Air Force was able to then support us and take our rocks to the other side of the peninsula close to the ship. So we were able to get our fossils out. So this was all thanks to us, a chance meeting with the head of the Antarctic Air Force when we were down in Antarctica visiting the Argentinian base. And this was how we passed the time at the Argentinian base. Here is the Vice Commodore himself. So that was quite an event. So the fossil forests from other collections at this time, we knew that there were already a lot of wood and leaves collected that indicated that there were some of these southern hemisphere South American monkey puzzles, tree ferns. There were no flowering plants until the Cretaceous, the time of the dinosaurs, but we also knew that there were palm trees growing in the Eocene from New Zealand, so a little bit later than the ones we were looking at, and they've since been discovered in Canada as well. And also some southern beech related to fagus, what we call nothofagus here, and it's still growing in Australia. And they had evolved in the Cretaceous. And interestingly, they were also the last trees to survive from 3 million years ago. So here's what they still look like today, most of this flora. The sedimentary layers in Seymour Island actually were very, very extensive and thick, and they went right through time from the Cretaceous. We could see all these vertebrae from these marine reptiles just littering the surface. So these were collected by other scientists as well to be studied. And you could see ammonites, which were from the Cretaceous period. And then we could stand across this layer where those marine reptiles and dinosaurs and ammonites all stopped, and we started seeing completely different types of animals at what's known at the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So it's one thin layer that goes right around the world. It's very rich in iridium. And they have found the smoking gun of the meteorite impact off Mexico as well. So there was not so much to do with climate change during this extinction. So here are our Argentinian colleagues sharing their tent and their beautiful food, as well as some American colleagues who were collecting the seashells and lobsters and crabs. And the Argentinians have reconstructed the fauna, just to give you a snapshot what it was like in West Antarctica at this time. It was very similar to what survives in South America today, with sloths, giant sloths, rhea, giant flightless birds, and other ungulates, opossums in the trees. And the penguins grew up to 2 meters high. So we could also find bones of these 2 meter high penguins. So the fossils that we were finding, the original descriptions had, I guess, split the ferns into a huge diverse array of types, whereas we discovered there were only 3 of these fern types, but you can still see these modern groups growing today in Australia and New Zealand. We found only 2 types of conifer, but again, they are directly related to the monkey puzzle from South America and a lot of other dinosaur era flora known as the family Araucariaceae from Australia, and the Wallamai pine as well, which is a dinosaur type. So in the Cretaceous were the earliest flowers. Here's a reconstruction. They were very, very small, and there were no trees at this time in the early Cretaceous. They were just herbaceous or creeping along the ground, very, very small. So remarkably, from 130 million years, this is a combination of fossils from here in Australia and in Spain. The flowering plants evolved rapidly into trees within a couple of tens of millions of years. And so by the late Cretaceous, we actually did see a lot of these groups evolving in the Southern Hemisphere. So by the Paleocene, after the extinction of the dinosaurs, we see these are the fossils from the Northern Shoal locality that help us to understand the diversity within the flowering plants. So Banksia is a really iconic plant in Australia. The equivalent in New Zealand is known as Knightia, from the same family. The Protea from South Africa, beg your pardon. They're no longer in South America. So these fossils have beautiful detail, and we were able to analyze them with modern techniques and draw parallels to these Proteaceae family that were extensive across Gondwana and they're still surviving in the Antarctic as large trees. Also, the southern beech, again, a very iconic fossil because it has been found right across South America, Australia, New Zealand, and it's still growing in these three places today, three countries, Patagonia. This beautiful tree that grows, it's very, very stunted actually, that grows in the highlands of Tasmania, southern Australia. You can see it has leaves that with these fan-like folding, known as plication. This indicates that it is deciduous. It is the only deciduous species of the southern beech in the whole of the southern hemisphere. And in the autumn, it will turn beautiful golds and reds. Remarkably, on our fossil leaf from Antarctica, we could see these strange fan-like folding in the leaves. So we have been able to associate that also with the way in which these were distributed as leaf litter across certain surfaces in layers within the rock. We could associate these with a deciduous habit. Interestingly, Nordenskjöld and Duchenne had described a whole array of different tropical elements within these Antarctic forests. And we thought, well, maybe they're completely off the track here. We need to study these in a lot more detail. But some of them didn't stand up to modern scrutiny, but certainly in this family, the Lauraceae were definitely present within these fossil forests from 56 million years ago in Antarctica. So these large trees that grow in tropical to subtropical environments today. And so it's certainly looking like these forests very diverse and much warmer. So let's have a look at the overall Paleogene. From the Paleocene 56 million years ago, we discovered that this revision of Duchenne using modern techniques, we were able to analyze the flora and show that there were 14 different kinds of flowering plants, reduced from the at least 50 types. We also discovered 23 new types that hadn't been photographed, and so a total of 37. This is extraordinarily diverse for forests in Antarctica, and what we think of as this cold, desert, dry climate. So it's really extraordinary that they were so diverse. They were also multi-stratal, multi-layered kinds of very, very well-developed forests. They also supported a whole lot of traces of insect feeding on them. So there were lots of multi-layered food webs at this time. They were a lot more developed than the forests that were fossilized from the same time on the West Antarctic Peninsula. And the West Antarctic was a lot higher in the Nothofagus, the southern beech, a lot lower in diversity. And also they weren't as multi-stratal. There were a lot of evidence of some layers being completely covered in liverworts and colonizers, just small plants that colonize, because within those fossil layers were actually some volcanic layers, such as ash layers, that helped show that there was a lot of more disturbance. Also, the volcanics of the Antarctic Peninsula were highest at this time, so it would have created a rain shadow, so much drier on the west. So this is why we're lucky to find these fossils showing such lush and well-developed forests that had some subtropical elements within them. So now I come to the last part of the talk to look at climate change. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about the science, if you like, because the Paleocene is such a significant time for understanding past climate and then what followed on through the whole Cenozoic. It was a very, very warm greenhouse, and then there were dramatic changes into icehouse world. So how did this happen? what was going on, what sort of part did our fossil plants play in that. Also, if we can understand these past natural systems of climate change and how they affect the plants and the biota, the forests and ecosystems, then we can better understand what's going to happen in natural systems in the future. And so we can mitigate against climate change in the future. So we discovered a lot more fossil wood on our trip, but this was ongoing for my colleagues, Jane Francis, who had originally discovered these trees could be used, or these fossil wood could be used to analyze past climates, utilizing tree rings, just like we do with modern trees. And so this was studies that were going on over a decade, collecting these fossil wood and analyzing them. And you can see they look like modern pieces of wood. It splinters, it looks identical to how you would pick up a piece of wood, but when you pick them up, they are extremely heavy. They are petrified. They are impregnated with silica, and so they've been churned into rock. But the rock actually surrounds all of the cell detail. So you can take these back, cut them with hard diamond saws and make thin sections, and you can see the cell detail within them. So these have been a fantastic resource that my colleagues published over the years, looking at how you can use these trees to understand past climate change. And this is pretty much on a yearly basis. You can also see these borings in the wood that have been subsequently filled with insect droppings and sediment. So they look just like modern wood. So they're showing these cool temperate climates. So what could we add to that with the leaves? Well, again, in the modern times, leaf edges have been, or margins have been associated and directly correlated with climates. So what we see as these dentate or serrate margins are correlated much more with cooler climates, whereas very, very smooth entire edges or margins are directly correlated with the percentage is directly correlated with mean annual temperature to show much warmer climates. So we were able to work with Professor Bob Spicer, who had developed not only looking at the actual leaf margin, but a multivariate statistics, looking at modern floras and correlating that back in time with climate. So some of the characters that we scored were just, for example, not only the margin, the shape, the size, the ratio of length to width to the characters, a host of different characters, and were then used in that Spicer's clamp program. And so it developed, analysed a mean annual temperature for our Paleocene flora forests at that time of around 13 degrees Celsius. So it's very similar to temperate zones in South America, Patagonia, for example, New Zealand and Southern Australia. It potentially was also getting up to warm monthly temperatures around 25 degrees Celsius and somewhere around 0 to 2 in the cold months. Growing precipitation also sitting around somewhere around the temperate zones. So this is how we plotted that cross valley flora, the northern shoulder flora, from the Paleocene 56 to 57 million years ago, and it's showing around 13 degrees. So there's our plot there. Now, what I've put this on from these analogues from today, growing in New Zealand, Tasmania and South America, Patagonia, we can compare that to data that's been taken from marine oxygen isotopes from the ocean. So the ocean temperatures have been analysed from fossils in the ocean limestones, and so they're really high resolution for time, and they show changes, dramatic changes in climate through the Cenozoic. So here's the Cretaceous, mass extinction. Here's the Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, what's known as the Palaeogene, and then into the modern Neogene today, 0. And this graph also shows predictions into the future. So you can see that warm Cretaceous, then a little bit cooler, then a sudden dramatic warming spike at the end of the Paleocene, what's known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, and then the Eocene. We also did the same analysis for the other floras that we discovered, which were much younger, from around 38 million years ago. We collected these on Seymour Island. We analysed them for their diversity. We also used the multivariate clamp analysis for temperature, and it was much cooler here during just after the middle Eocene here. So this is immediately before the Antarctic ice sheets were able to grow. So that's why the Cenozoic is a fascinating time for looking at past climate and using these as analogues for the future. In fact, that spike in the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum of temperature, we can look at the evidence from the fossil record to understand how is that significant, how is that we can use that as an analog for what might happen in the future if we get sudden spikes in carbon dioxide. And also, when is this going to happen in the future using model predictions from IPCC. So Antarctica, back in the Cretaceous, you may have heard of Gondwana. It was part of this supercontinent joined with Africa, South America, India, and Australia, and New Zealand. So this broke up during the Jurassic Cretaceous, and it was still a land bridge between Australia and Antarctica and South America and the Antarctic Peninsula. So this was the region we were collecting the fossils from. During the Cenozoic, at the end of the Eocene, this final land bridge broke. So what did that mean for the Antarctic climate? So during the Paleocene, we've shown this is very, very warm forests extending across Antarctic Peninsula and into Antarctica with some subtropical elements. The average temperature is around 13, equivalent to today for these belts in the cool temperate forests. So when that land bridge finally broke, what happened? Well, it developed what's known as the modern Antarctic circumpolar current. So we see that there's Tasmania had broken off about 38 million. It was originally thought it was exactly at 34 million that this final break occurred, and that was the cause of glaciation. So does this stand up to, again, modern scrutiny and modern analysis of ongoing fossil analysis of isotopes in the ocean? But if we're only looking at the ocean for understanding temperatures, is there a different story on land? And so that's why our flora is actually very significant, because it's one of the few land signatures. So the Eocene-Oligocene boundary is at 34 million. So this is the detail. Again, here the dinosaur extinction occurred, 66 million. Here's the Paleocene-Eocene. Here is that spike known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Then we see the Eocene to Oligocene, a sudden dramatic drop in temperature with glaciation. And this is the switch from greenhouse climates to icehouse climates during this Cenozoic overall cooling. So why? Let's think about why. Why was the Paleocene-Eocene so warm? Why was there a thermal maximum? Why was there Eocene greenhouse? What made the world switch from greenhouse to icehouse? So I will just briefly have a look at that now in the last 5 minutes to think about some reasons that are driving these dramatic changes into warming greenhouse and then switching to icehouse. So, as I said, the breakup of Gondwana, this final separation of South America from Antarctica, was thought to be the sole driver of that sudden dramatic switch. What was discovered back in around the very early 1900s again was that there were external drivers of climate. All of this temperature changes switching through the past climate, when past climates were first studied, were discovered to be directly correlated to Earth's journey around the sun. So currently we journey around the sun, we have our seasons, we all know about the seasons, but what a lot of people don't realize is that we actually change our path around the sun over geological time. So it will go from circular, like it is at the moment, to very, very oval path. Our Earth is on a tilt from its axis. And also, as the Earth spins, just like a basketball spins on your finger, it will wobble. So Earth has a wobble. So the amounts of solar flare and radiation change, and our orbit around the sun changes. And we've seen plate tectonics, Gondwana, breaking up during the early Cenozoic final separation there. So it was thought that they were the only drivers in long geological time. In modern times, we understand the greenhouse effect, the reflectivity of our atmosphere, causing solar radiation to either be reflected or trapped as the warm radiates back off the land surface. We also understand about reflectivity. I mentioned the ice albedo reflecting off the ice. So the greater the surface area, like in the last glacial maximum, the greater the reflectivity. So these have also played amazing parts in geological time. And so this evidence is really just coming to the fore. And so our flora was able to play a little small part just to show the land effects of that. So going back to our chart, end of Cretaceous, the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, we showed that it was very, very warm, temperate climates in Antarctica with lush, well-developed multistratal forests growing. The Paleocene, Eocene was a dramatic, rapid in geological times, only 10,000 years of warming. What caused this? So ocean studies have actually shown that there was a sudden release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's thought most of the evidence is pointing towards this carbon dioxide sourced from deep ocean cold seeps, okay, methane seeps that we still see today, cold seeps in the ocean. So this not only caused warming around the thermal maximum, it also made feedbacks into a whole greenhouse world, hothouse here, with the Eocene. It was very, very, very hot thermal maximum, much warmer than the earliest parts of the Cenozoic here. And so that carbon dioxide not only had effect at the time of 8 degrees of warming, but it also then had that feedback knock-on effect to form a greenhouse. So this is why we need to understand these systems to help us understand what will happen in the future if we keep this rapid carbon dioxide warming. The other end of the scale, we had our second flora showing cooling just after the Middle Eocene. And then we see this sudden dramatic drop in temperature and switch to an icehouse world. So these glacial interglacial cycles, yes, they are correlated to orbital cycles and solar radiation. Yes, some of this may have been caused by that separation of plate tectonics of final separation of Gondwana, but recent study on the small microfossils of pollen and spores from sediments in southern Australia, helping to show right around the world that carbon isotopes from the land have also indicated drop in carbon dioxide. So it was really down to the carbon dioxide that we're getting these extreme changes in temperature through the Cenozoic and into the cooling icehouse. So that's just to reiterate that we had that dramatic warming in the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, made a knock-on feedback effect. You can see the carbon dioxide then proceeded to really start to increase in the atmosphere, causing feedbacks into a greenhouse climate. But when it dropped, we see that initiation of ice sheets in Antarctica, cooling, And so plate tectonic's timing was wrong. It was too early for the growth of these ice sheets in Antarctica. It was the declining carbon dioxide shown from land carbon isotopes from plant spores and pollen. And so our two floras feed into that story. They're a very, very small part, but it's a fascinating story. So we're seeing evidence from fossils showing these beautiful floras and forests of very, very, very well developed, growing on the sides of the Antarctic Peninsula volcanoes, but a sudden switch and dramatic change. Just within a few 100,000 years, the Paleocene Eocene was only 10,000 years. So it was very, very short in geological time. What we don't want to see is going back to this time, though. It might be great for the plants, but not for humans. Humans have only experienced and existed during these icehouse times. So the key message then is that the rate of warming, even in the Paleocene Eocene, over 10,000 years with 8 degrees of warming, is still nothing like what human-induced warming is doing to our planet. This rate of warming is unprecedented in the geological record, and we're already at 2 degrees in 200 years. We're heading for this extreme high rates, 25 petagrams of carbon per year, for example, compared to only 1.7 during that 56 million years ago, Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. So we need to do something, and thankfully there are global efforts now to stem this carbon dioxide increases in our atmosphere, because it will only take a couple hundred years to reach those Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum 8 degrees warming if we stay on our current trajectory. So just to give you a couple of extra beautiful photos, because I couldn't resist, it's just a unique, special place. And as I said, I was very fortunate to spend time there. On our homeward journey, here is all the sea ice that was pushed by the storms down around our small Seymour Island. Once we got back onto the ship, we were able to go to the Falkland Islands and experience the local fauna. It's an experience in itself, the elephant seals. I have never experienced an aroma quite like it, and they are very territorial. They are social, so they do hang out in big, large colonies, but they are also quite good at fighting over the females in their little space. So there was a lot of this going on. Here you can see these young males practicing, and they have a lot of scars on them from these fights. The bird life in Falklands is extraordinary. These oyster catchers are very rare, as are a lot of the bird of prey. We were lucky to see these albatross with the largest wingspan of all birds out in the open ocean as well. And the penguins. There's so many species of penguins. It was just such an experience to see these colonies. They're real characters. They carry on at each other with all their calls of quite different sounds for different species and different markings. Here we have Gen 2. Here we have, sorry, I think that's Adelie and that's Gen 2. And this is an Adelie in Seymour Island. And these are the macaroni penguins. They look like little rock punk kind of ones, and they hop around on the rocks as well. And here you can see the king penguin colonies in the Falklands. They have these creches for their young that they all help look after, so that the parents can alternate going out to the sea and collecting penguins and feeding their young. So here's the feeding of the young, and they do pair up for quite some time, though not for life like the emperor penguins, but they are real characters. So I'd like to thank you for having me at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. I hope you enjoyed my talk of sharing my experience in Antarctica, in that unique and special place. And hopefully you've learned a little bit about the amazing fossils from Antarctica and about our own Earth history of climate during this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for that excellent and thought-provoking talk. We'll open it up now to questions if anybody has any. Well, I'll ask a question while we wait. Oh, we just had one come in. So the question is, how does it feel to work in such an amazing place covered in ice today, and knowing that it was so green before and maybe millions of years from now will be green again?
Thanks for your question. It was extremely special to be able to spend time. So I had 2 months down on the ice. Well, originally when we first arrived, it was extremely warm, 8 degrees relatively. And so from Australia point of view, that's actually pretty cold for me. But yeah, it was very, very warm at that stage. We were able to hike around and find so many of the fossils. It was very, very special experience. And it's one that I treasure for my life, you know, such a life-changing experience. It's still at the forefront of a frontier of our exploration and our science today. So to be able to be part of that science community was very special as well. I was blown away to be able to meet these people, these other scientists down there who are all trying to understand our natural system and our natural world and how special it is in our whole solar system and potentially our whole universe. So to be able to find fossils that no one has seen for 56 million years, to be open up those rocks, and there are those fossils lying on the surface, and they are telling us a story about Earth's past. So I agree that it's not just the past that's crucial to understand, but also thinking about what will happen in the future. So we really have to make global efforts to reduce that melting of the ice sheets, because if it goes back into you know, these high excursions of carbon dioxide, that might produce warming for a short time, but it can also, with the feedbacks, go into runaway greenhouse climates. And so the plants would love it. They love extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But yeah, as I said, humans have only been around. Our genus is 2 million years old. And during this time, it has been only the icehouse experience for our species. So I think we're intelligent enough. We have the means. There's so many amazing scientists coming up with solutions today.
So we've got a few more questions coming in now. So the next question is, early in the talk, you mentioned there were no flowering plants until 130 million years ago. Is this in reference to Antarctica specifically, or is that globally?
Thanks for your question. Yes. Sorry if I didn't make that clear, that is globally. So all of the plant history goes right back to somewhere around 400 million years ago. So there have been plants on the land coming out of the ocean somewhere around that 400 million years ago. So they've been around for a very long time. There's also studies that show that the plants change the atmosphere and increase the amount of oxygen. And so this helped all of the other life forms to evolve and come out onto the land and follow the plants into these new ecological niches. So this is why the vertebrates came out of the oceans and eventually evolved many, many branches and stories in between, but humans were able to evolve from that. So the plants themselves were very, what we call lower type plants like mosses and lycophytes for a significant part of their history. And then we started to see the seed evolve somewhere around 300 million years ago. And so those conifers, what we see today, like in the taiga forests in the northern hemisphere, the conifers, they have been around, for hundreds of millions of years, but extraordinarily the flowering plants were nowhere to be seen until 130 million globally. In Antarctica, the Cretaceous age fossils do also show that flowering plants reached Antarctica probably a little bit later. somewhere around maybe 100 million years ago.
Great. Another question here. What insects were associated with the plants in Antarctica?
Oh, thanks for that question. Yeah, there's just amazing variety of insects that have been associated. So most of the leaves show little traces of feeding, and so you can see some of the insects were nibbling around the edges. Some of the insects were actually mining into the leaf and eating the soft interior. Some of them were munching little round holes. And so they've been associated with things like grasshoppers that can eat the edges, a lot of caterpillars of moths in particular, moths and butterflies, often burrowing into the leaves, and a lot of beetles that are like munching away big holes and etc. in the leaves. There's also the wood borers that I mentioned as well. So yeah, there's this amazing diversity in Antarctica, and it's really strange to think that that cold frozen environment with only 2 species of flowering plants isn't supporting. There's no trees, there's no lush forests, and none of that sort of food web diversity that we see back in 56 million years ago.
We have another question here for you, Anne-Marie. It comes from one of our other researchers here at the museum. The question is, are there any known vertebrates from Antarctica of the same time interval? Are there any late Paleocene vertebrates known from these the Antarctic environments? Or in general, do we know what sort of animals were living there?
Sure. So that is a good question. So I'll just go back to the reconstruction from the Argentinians. This was based on the fossils from the middle to late Eocene. Sorry, here we go. So this is a beautiful drawing by in Reguero et al. From these Argentinian vertebrate paleontologists. So it is slightly later, but from what I remember, also in the late Paleocene, there still are the large penguins, and there still are some of the early whale relatives, although I can't remember if I think that's late Paleocene as well, certainly into the Eocene. So by the Eocene, there's certainly this amazing diversity. And so, the short answer is it's not coming back right this moment, but I will be able to email you how many of these types go back into the late Paleocene from the Eocene. But yes, there were certainly still some vertebrates down there at that time.
Right. I have a question for you. Do you want to go back? And if you could go back, what would you do this time around?
Thanks, Chris. I'm speechless about what an experience it was, and I would jump at any chance to go back, of course. So we have a postdoc at the moment who was looking at those spores and pollen, the microfossils from Australia, and looking at understanding those dramatic climate changes using carbon isotopes. And so maybe in the future, that would be an awesome addition to our leaf and wood analyses from the land, would be to be able to go back, get a better handle on the biostratigraphy, the ages of all of these different strata from the microspores and pollen, but also, additional evidence for climate changes in those terrestrial environments. So there's potentially a lot more erosion has happened as well. So who knows, if we go back, I would love to do further collections from the layers, especially if we're able to get better dates from all of those. We could then, hopefully have higher resolution for our forest times through there, and see if we can get better resolution on that as well. So there's a lot more that can be done. I mean, given there was the first initial study and collections in 1901, there was another one published by Case in 1988. There was a big trip to Seymour Island, lots of disciplinary studies at that time. And again, from the early 2000s, you could see the vertebrates, the sediments, a lot of effort to study that those sediments. And again, recently, there have been a lot of focus on the sedimentary rocks, and there's a lot of new data and some, isotope ages coming out as well. So it'd be great to be able to add to that with the plant side story.
Fantastic. Are there any more questions? Well, it doesn't seem like it. So I'll thank you again, Anne-Marie, for your lovely talk. Thank you very much. We certainly appreciate it. And I'd like to remind everybody that next week we will have somebody else speaking. Hold on just a moment while I bring that up. Should be prepared here. While I'm looking for this, Anne-Marie, what was the dominant vegetation back in the Paleocene in Antarctica? Was there one plant that was more numerous than others?
So it's really interesting to look at the variation in the forests at that time. So the little plant I have behind me here is the Nothofagus, the southern beech. And so they were probably the dominant trees. Certainly by the Eocene and on the west side, these are the dominant trees at the west side of the peninsula in the Paleocene. More on the east side, where I found amazing diversity, they play a lesser role. The other really interesting trees were those Araucaria, so the modern monkey puzzle tree relatives. And so they tend to be growing certainly more on the west side in those drier kinds of environments, and also probably at higher altitude, just like we see them growing in South America today.
Great, thank you.
And thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yes, and I'll remind everybody that next week, our next speaker series talk will be by Aaron Kilmary from the University of Manitoba, and his talk will be the vertebrate faunal assemblages of the Lake Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway of Manitoba, Canada. Thanks again, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.